Welcome back to Haunted Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 true disturbing stories from park rangers who have encountered things in the wilderness that defy explanation. These are tales of people who dedicated their lives to protecting our forests, only to discover that some places don't want protection, they want to be left alone. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The Cascade Ridge Backcountry Station sits about 18 miles from the nearest paved road, tucked into a fold of mountains that most hikers never bother with. The trails out there are poorly marked, the elevation gain is brutal, and cell service disappeared about a decade ago when the old tower went down and nobody saw fit to replace it. I'd requested the posting specifically because of all that. After 6 years of dealing with drunk campers at the lake stations and writing citations for illegal fires, I wanted solitude. I wanted to remember why I'd become a ranger in the first place. My name, S. Garrett Hutchins, and I still think about my first autumn at Cascade Ridge every single day. The station itself was a small cabin, maybe 400 square feet, with a wood stove, a propane stove for cooking, and a narrow bunk that smelled like mice and old wool. The ranger before me had left it reasonably clean, though I found a coffee mug with something growing in it under the bunk that made me gag. There was a logbook on the desk where I was supposed to record observations, weather conditions, any incidents. The last entry was dated September 3rd. Quiet day, checked North Trail markers. The handwriting was neat, careful. The ranger's name had been Peter Voss, and according to my supervisor, he transferred to a station near the coast after just 1 season at Cascade Ridge. I didn't ask why, I probably should have. The first 2 weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. I hiked the trails, cleared fallen branches, noted where erosion was eating at the path. I saw exactly 4 other people, a couple doing a through hike who looked relieved to see the cabin, filled their water bottles, and kept moving. The nights were cold enough that I kept the wood stove burning, and I'd sit outside on the small porch with my dinner, watching the light drain out of the sky. The forest would go quiet right around dusk, like someone had thrown a switch. I told myself it was natural, just animals bedding down for the night. It was mid-October when I found the first marker. I'd been checking the eastern boundary trail, which looped through a dense section of old-growth fir and hemlock. The canopy was thick enough that even at midday it felt like twilight down on the forest floor. I was marking a hazard tree, a big hemlock with a split trunk that would probably come down in the next windstorm, when I noticed something off the trail, maybe 20 yards into the undergrowth. At first, I thought it was surveyor's tape. We used bright orange or pink tape to mark trails and boundary lines, but this wasn't tape. As I got closer, pushing through sword ferns that came up to my waist, I realized it was wire. Thin wire, maybe the kind you use for picture hanging, strung between 2 trees at about chest height. Hanging from the wire were small objects that twisted slowly in the breeze coming through the canopy. Bones, small bones, bleached white. They'd been drilled through and threaded onto the wire with what looked like fishing line. Between them, someone had tied bits of bark with symbols carved into them, shapes I didn't recognize. Circles with lines radiating out. Spirals. Something that might have been a handprint, but with too many fingers. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring. My first thought was that it was some kind of art installation, but we were miles from anywhere, and there were rules about leaving things in the back country. My second thought was that it might be something religious, though I couldn't place what tradition would do something like this. The bones were small, bird bones, maybe, or rodents. The wire ran between 2 trees that were growing so close together Their roots had probably merged underground. I took photos with the digital camera I carried for documenting trail conditions. The bones rotated gently in the breeze, clicking against each other with a sound like wind chimes made of teeth. I reached out to touch one and then stopped myself. Something about disturbing it felt wrong, like breaking a seal I didn't understand. I hiked back to the cabin faster than I'd intended, my breath coming hard despite the relatively easy terrain. That night, I wrote up the incident in the logbook, trying to keep my language neutral and professional. Found object on Eastern Boundary Trail, approx. 1.3 miles from cabin. Wire strung between trees with animal bones and carved symbols. Origin unknown. No signs of recent human activity in immediate area. I didn't mention that I dreamed about it, or that in the dream the bones had been humming. 3 days later, I found another one. This time on the North Trail, the one that followed the ridgeline before dropping down toward a seasonal creek. Same setup, wire between trees, bones, carved bark. But this marker had something else hanging from it. A small leather pouch, the kind you might use for tobacco or coins. I knew better than to open it. I took my photos and backed away, and this time I noticed something I'd missed before. There were no animal tracks near the markers. Not on the trail, not in the soft earth around the trees. The forest floor near them was completely undisturbed, like nothing had walked there in years. But the wire was new. I could tell by the lack of rust, the way it hadn't sagged yet from weather. I radioed it in to my supervisor, which meant hiking to the high point on the ridge where I could sometimes get a signal on the emergency radio. The response was crackly but clear enough. Document, photograph, do not disturb. Someone would come out to investigate when weather permitted, probably in a few weeks. In the meantime, continue normal patrol duties. Normal, right. I started finding them everywhere. The Western Trail had 3 clustered close together near a spot where the path crossed an old rock slide. The Southern Trail had 2, positioned on either side of a narrow gap between 2 massive cedar trees. And one night, when I stepped out to take a piss before bed, I found one strung between trees maybe 30 feet from my cabin door. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone. The undergrowth around the cabin was thick with salal and Oregon grape, the kind of vegetation that crackles and rustles if you so much as brush against it. But this marker had appeared in complete silence. The carved symbols on this one were different, more deliberate, more complex. They looked almost like writing, though not in any alphabet I knew. And the bones, I forced myself to look closer with my flashlight. The bones weren't from birds or rodents. They were longer, jointed. Finger bones, maybe, human finger bones. I went inside and locked the door, which I'd never bothered to do before. The lock was just a simple sliding bolt, the kind that would stop nothing if someone really wanted to get in. I sat on my bunk with my back against the wall and my radio in my hand, even though I knew there was no signal from inside the cabin. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. Footsteps outside, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. They'd pause at each wall, then continue. The crunch of boots on fallen needles, the snap of a twig. I held completely still, barely breathing, my hand clenched so tight around the radio that my knuckles ached. The footsteps stopped at the door. I watched the handle, waiting for it to move. Instead, I heard a sound like fingernails dragging down the wood. Long, slow scrapes that made my teeth hurt. Then nothing, just the wind in the trees and the settling creaks of the cabin itself. At first light, I was outside with my flashlight, examining the ground. There were prints, boot prints, clear in the soft earth near the door. But here's what made my hand start shaking. The prints only appeared in a circle around the cabin. There were no prints leading to the circle, none leading away. Just that perfect ring of boot prints, like someone had been lowered from the sky, walked their circle and been lifted away. I packed a bag. Essential supplies, my radio, my documentation. I told myself I was just going to hike to the ridgeline, get a signal, request immediate extraction. But when I opened the door, I stopped. There were more markers, dozens of them, strung between every tree I could see, forming a dense network of wire and bone that surrounded the cabin completely. They turned slowly in the morning breeze, clicking and rattling. The sound was like locusts, like static, like something trying to form words but not quite managing it. I stepped back inside and closed the door. For 2 days I stayed in the cabin. I burned through my propane making coffee I barely drank. I tried the radio every hour, getting nothing but dead air. The markers stayed up, moving in the wind. At night, the footsteps would circle the cabin, always the same pattern, always stopping at the door. On the third morning, they were gone, all of them. I checked every direction, pushed through the undergrowth until my hands were scratched and bleeding from the thorns. Not a single wire remained, not one bone. Even the bark carvings had vanished. The only evidence they'd ever existed was in my camera and in the logbook. And the boot prints. Those remained, circling the cabin like something had worn a groove into the earth. I hiked out that day. It took me 6 hours of hard walking to reach the trailhead where I'd left my truck. My supervisor was understanding when I requested a transfer. He didn't ask many questions. He did mention, though, that the ranger before me, Peter Voss, had reported similar findings. Wire markers, bones, symbols. Peter had lasted 1 season. I lasted 6 weeks. I work at a state park now, the kind with paved paths and interpretive signs and families taking photos of their kids in front of the waterfall. It's good work, safe work. But sometimes, when I'm closing up the visitor center at dusk and the last families are packing up their minivans, I see something that makes me freeze. A piece of wire in the fence line, a small bone in the gravel, symbols scratched into the bark of the trees near the parking lot. And I wonder if those markers were warnings meant to keep something in or to keep us out. I never found out, and I never went back to learn. Story 2. I inherited 40 acres in the Adirondacks from my Uncle Dennis when I was 32. We hadn't been particularly close. He was my father's older brother, a guy who'd gone off the grid sometime in the 70s and lived in a hunting cabin he'd built himself, without electricity or running water. I'd visited maybe twice as a kid, before my parents decided the drive wasn't worth it and Uncle Dennis was a bit much for regular family contact. The lawyer's letter came in March. Dennis had died of a heart attack. They'd found him in the cabin, and he'd left the property to me. No other relatives wanted it. The land was too remote, too difficult to develop or sell. I was working a job I hated, living in an apartment that smelled like the Indian restaurant downstairs, and the idea of owning actual land, of having a place to escape to, felt like winning a lottery I hadn't entered. My name's Claire Sorensen, and I should have asked why nobody else wanted it. I drove up in early May, when the black flies were just starting to emerge, and the forest was that almost painful shade of new green. The cabin was about 6 miles down a Forest Service road that deteriorated into barely more than a track, deep ruts filled with mud and standing water. My Subaru bottomed out twice before I finally reached the clearing where Uncle Dennis had built his place. The cabin was small but solid, built from logs he'd probably cut and milled himself. There was a covered porch with a rocking chair that had seen better days, a stone chimney on the north side, and windows with actual glass panes which surprised me. I'd been expecting something more primitive. The door was unlocked. Why'd bother locking anything out here? And inside I found a single room with a wood stove, a table and 2 chairs, a bed frame with a bare mattress, and shelves lined with canned goods and books. A lot of books. Field guides mostly, survival manuals, some worn paperback westerns. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. Nobody had been here since they'd taken Uncle Dennis's body out. I spent the first day just cleaning, airing the place out, checking for leaks in the roof or signs of animals getting in. The cabin was sound. Uncle Dennis had known what he was doing. I found his journal in a drawer in the table, just a composition notebook with entries in tight, cramped handwriting. Most of it was mundane. Weather observations, notes on deer movement, recipes for things like squirrel stew that made my stomach turn a little. The last entry was dated 2 days before he died. It just said, "They're closer now, heard them at the tree line after dark. Same pattern as last autumn. I think they're waiting." I told myself it was just an old man living alone, maybe getting a little paranoid in his isolation. Bears, maybe, or coyotes. The woods were full of sounds at night, full of animals with their own patterns and territories. Nothing unusual about that. I stayed that first night, unrolled my sleeping bag on the bare mattress, got a fire going in the stove even though the evening was mild. I'd brought groceries, including a bottle of decent whiskey, and I sat on the porch as the light failed, drinking from a chipped mug and listening to the forest settle into its evening routine. The birds went quiet first, then the insects. By the time full dark arrived, the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. That's when I heard them walking, multiple footsteps in the undergrowth, coming from the tree line about 50 yards from the cabin. Not running, not rushing, just walking steady and deliberate. I stood up trying to see into the darkness beyond the porch. My flashlight was inside and I cursed myself for not having it in hand. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed up by the trees. The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear. Nothing. Just that oppressive silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath with me. Then one of them called back, "Hello." It was my voice, my exact voice, the same pitch and tone, even the slight uncertainty I'd had when I'd called out. But it came from the darkness near the tree line, from a point too low to be a person standing upright. I stumbled backward into the cabin and slammed the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the bolt thrown. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window, shining it out toward where the voice had come from. The beam caught movement. Multiple figures pulling back into the trees. I only saw them for a second, pale, too tall, moving with a fluidity that wasn't quite right. Their limbs bent at angles that made my stomach lurch. I kept the flashlight trained on the tree line, but they didn't come back into the light. Eventually, I heard the footsteps again, but moving away now, circling around the cabin. They'd pause every few seconds, then continue. It took me a while to realize they were stopping at specific points, the same points each circuit, like they were marking something. I didn't sleep, just sat in the chair by the stove with my flashlight and my uncle's journal, reading through his entries from the past few years. As it got closer to the final entry, the mundane observations gave way to something else. Mentions of sounds at night, figures in the tree line. Things that called out in voices they shouldn't have. And then, about 3 months before he died, Uncle Dennis had written, "Found the markers today, 12 of them in a circle around the cabin, about 60 yards out. Same as the old stories, meant to keep them at bay, but I think they're testing the boundary." I waited until first light, then went outside. The morning was cool and damp, mist hanging in the trees. I forced myself to walk toward the tree line, following the direction where I'd seen the figures. I found the markers about 20 yards out, Stones, mostly stacked in small cairns about 3 feet high, but mixed with the stones were other things. Deer antlers stripped of velvet, animal skulls sun-bleached and picked clean, and bones, long bones that I really hoped were from deer or bear. There were gaps in the circle, places where the markers had fallen or been knocked over. The stones were scattered, the bones broken and scattered into the undergrowth. Something had broken through. I ran back to the cabin, threw my stuff into my sleeping bag without bothering to pack it properly, and got in my car. The Subaru started on the first try, which felt like a miracle. I drove those 6 miles in probably 10 minutes, not caring about the undercarriage, not caring about anything except getting back to pavement and cell phone signal and other people. I listed the property with a realtor 3 weeks later. A stick cabin on 40 wooded acres, privacy and solitude. It took 8 months to sell, finally going to a buyer from New York City who wanted a weekend retreat. I didn't mention what was in my uncle's journal. I didn't mention the voices or the markers or the figures at the tree line. I sometimes wonder if the new owner found the journal, if they've experienced what I did. I checked the news occasionally, searching for stories about the Adirondacks, about missing hikers or unexplained deaths. Nothing so far, but last week I got an email from a realtor I don't recognize. The subject line just said, "Your property questions. I haven't opened it. I'm not sure I want to know what they're asking about, because the thing is I've started hearing footsteps again, not in the Adirondacks. I live in Vermont now, 200 miles away from my uncle's land. But some nights, when I take my dog out for his last walk, I hear them in the woods behind my apartment complex. Steady footsteps circling, and sometimes, just barely, I hear my own voice calling out from the darkness. I think they remember me, and I think they know where I went." A story 3. The Stillwater Fire Lookout sits at about 7,300 feet, accessible only by a 5-mile trail that switches back and forth up the mountainside like a wound that won't quite heal. I'd applied for the job as a lookout on a whim, needing to get away from a relationship that had gone bad and a city that felt like it was suffocating me. The posting had been simple: May through September, 40-hour weeks, solo operation. Report fires, maintain equipment, keep detailed weather logs. I'd done a season as a wilderness guide right out of college, so I knew I could handle the isolation. I'm Tobias Marsh, and I learned that isolation comes in different varieties. Some of them aren't what you expect. I hiked up to the lookout on May 15th with 2 weeks' worth of supplies in my pack. The service would do supply runs via helicopter every 2 weeks if weather permitted. The trail was still muddy from snowmelt, and patches of snow clung to the north-facing slopes. By the time I reached the lookout tower, my legs were burning and my lungs felt raw from the thin air. The tower itself was a small wooden structure on stilts, maybe 14 feet off the ground, with windows on all sides and a metal ladder leading up to the trapdoor entrance. Inside was a single room with a bed, a small propane stove, a desk with the fire finder mounted in the center, and shelves for supplies. Previous lookouts had left small marks of their presence, carved initials in the window frames, a faded Grateful Dead sticker on the propane tank, a paperback mystery with a broken spine abandoned on the bed. The view was extraordinary. I could see across 3 valleys, watch weather systems moving between peaks, track the shadow of clouds across the landscape. For the first few days, I felt like I'd made the right decision. I'd wake up at dawn, make coffee on the propane stove, and spend the day scanning for smoke plumes, reading, watching birds ride the thermals. At night, the stars were so bright and so numerous that they stopped looking like individual points and started looking like a solid field of light. Solitude felt like healing, like I was remembering how to be a person without the constant noise of other people's expectations. The incident happened on my 10th day up there. I'd seen exactly 3 other people since arriving, a couple of thru-hikers who stopped at the base of the tower to fill their water bottles and chat for a few minutes before moving on. Otherwise, just me and the mountain and the silence. I was sitting at the desk that evening, updating the weather log, when I heard someone climbing the ladder. Boot steps on metal rungs, steady and confident. I looked at the trap door, expecting it to swing open, expecting to see maybe a ranger or a hiker who'd wandered off trail. The steps reached the platform outside the door. I could hear them walking around the catwalk that circled the tower. "Hello," I called out. "Doors open if you need something." The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long pause, they started again. But instead of coming to the door, they continued circling, around and around the tower, steady and measured. I went to the window and looked down. The sun was setting, light going golden and thick, but I could still see clearly. There was nobody on the catwalk, nobody on the ladder. The footsteps continued circling, and I could hear them clearly, the specific sound of boot tread on wooden planks, but there was nothing there. I stood at the window for maybe 20 minutes, watching and listening. The footsteps circled 7 times, then stopped. After a moment of silence, I heard them descending the ladder, all the way down to the ground, where they faded into the evening sounds of the mountain. I checked the entry log, a notebook where previous lookouts had recorded unusual events or notable observations. I flipped back through pages of entries, whether observations, wildlife sightings, notes on trail conditions. Then I found an entry from 2 seasons ago, written by someone named Marcus Webb. Day 31, heard footsteps on catwalk tonight. No one there. Second time this week. Starting to think the isolation is getting to me. 3 pages later, another entry in the same handwriting. Day 45, footsteps again. They stopped at the door this time. I could hear breathing on the other side. Lasted maybe 5 minutes. I didn't open the door, not sure what I would have found. The final entry from Marcus was dated a week later. Day 52, requesting early evacuation. I need to get off this mountain. I kept reading. Other lookouts had mentioned hearing things, voices on the wind, footsteps, tapping on the windows. One person had written, "Something mimics the radio static. It sounds like a voice trying to come through, but when I respond, it just laughs." That night I lay in the narrow bed and tried to convince myself it was just wind, just the tower settling, just the altitude playing tricks with my hearing. The human brain isn't built for this much solitude. We start filling in the empty spaces with patterns and meaning, even when there's nothing there. I almost believed it until I heard my name, Tobias. It came from directly below the tower, spoken in a flat, affectless voice. Not shouted, not whispered, just spoken at a normal conversational volume, like someone was standing right there expecting me to hear. I went to the window. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows. The ground around the tower was empty. Nothing moved in the trees at the edge of the clearing. Tobias Marsh. This time it came from behind me. I spun around, but the tower was small enough that I could see every corner. Empty. Just my supplies and my equipment, and the firefinder glinting in the moonlight. "I know you can hear me, Tobias." The voice was coming from the trap door. From beneath the trapdoor, actually like someone was lying on the platform directly below the entrance, speaking up through the gap around the door frame. I didn't respond. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay silent, to not engage, to pretend I couldn't hear it. "You should come down, Tobias. There's something I need to show you." The voice was patient. That was the worst part. It wasn't threatening or menacing. It just sounded like a reasonable person making a reasonable request. I turned off my propane lamp, plunging the tower into darkness except for the moonlight. I got into bed fully clothed, pulled the sleeping bag over my head and waited. The voice continued for a while, my name, invitations to come down, assurances that everything was fine and I shouldn't be afraid. Eventually it stopped. The footsteps started again an hour later, circling the tower over and over. I counted 23 circuits before I finally fell into a thin, anxious sleep. At first light, I went outside onto the catwalk. I needed to see if there were footprints, any evidence of what had been out there. The wooden planks of the catwalk were worn smooth from years of weather and foot traffic, so prints were unlikely, but I had to check. What I found was worse than footprints. Someone had carved words into the railing. Fresh carving, the wood still pale where it had been gouged. The letters were crude but legible, running along about 6 feet of the railing. DONT, GO down, DONT go down, DONT go down. The words repeated until they ran out of space, then started again on the next section of railing, all the way around the tower. The same message, carved over and over in letters that got more frantic, more desperate toward the end. I looked at my hands. No splinters, no cuts, no sign I'd been the one doing the carving. But who else could it have been? I radioed for evacuation that morning. The dispatcher asked if there was an emergency, if I was injured or sick. I told her I needed to come down, that I'd explain when I got off the mountain. She said the next helicopter run was scheduled for 3 days from now, but if it was urgent, they could probably arrange something sooner. I told her 3 days was fine. I lied. Those 3 days are difficult to describe. The footsteps came every night, always after dark. The voice would call my name, sometimes from below, sometimes from the trees, once from directly above the tower, like something was hovering in the air over the roof. During the day, I'd find new carvings, not just on the railing now, but on the trapdoor, on the window frames, on the desk. Always the same message, DONT down. I didn't go down, not even to refill my water from the spring at the base of the tower. I rationed what I had, went thirsty when it ran out. I stayed in the tower with the trapdoor locked and my eyes on the windows and my radio in my hand. On the final night, something tried to open the trapdoor. I heard it climbing the ladder, not boots this time, but something that made a different sound. Scraping, maybe, or sliding. It reached the platform and moved to the trapdoor. The handle turned, slowly testing the lock. When it didn't open, the thing on the other side began to push. The door lifted a fraction of an inch, held only by the simple bolt lock. I put my weight on the door, pressing down, and I felt the resistance from below. Whatever was pushing had strength. The bolt began to bend, the screws holding it to the frame starting to pull free. That's when I started screaming. Just screaming, wordless and panicked, screaming until my throat was raw. And the pressure stopped. Whatever was below the door released it, and I heard it descending the ladder. Not quickly, not fleeing, just climbing down at the same measured pace it had climbed up. The helicopter came at dawn. The pilot helped me gather my gear, asking if I was okay, saying I looked rough. I told him I'd had some bad nights, wasn't sleeping well, maybe altitude sickness. He nodded, understanding, and flew me down to the ranger station. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. What would I say? That I'd heard voices and footsteps. that I'd found carvings I might have done myself in some fugue state brought on by isolation. They'd send me to a doctor, maybe a psychiatrist. They'd mark me as unreliable, unsuited for solo work. A different lookout was assigned to Stillwater for the rest of the season. I heard he lasted 3 weeks before requesting reassignment due to personal reasons. The tower is abandoned now. They've installed automated fire detection systems, cameras and sensors that don't require a human presence. I'm glad. I hope nobody ever stays in that tower again. But sometimes I wake up in the night and hear footsteps circling my apartment. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear my name spoken in that flat, patient voice. It's been 2 years since I left the mountain, but I think part of me is still up there. Part of me never made it down. And the worst part, I can't remember what I carved those warnings for. I can't remember what I knew I shouldn't do, what danger I was trying to warn myself about. I just know I've been feeling this urge lately, this need to go back up there, to climb that ladder one more time and see what's waiting at the top. I haven't done it yet, but the urge is getting stronger. A story 4. Boundary Peak Wilderness Area covers about 60,000 acres of some of the roughest backcountry in the Pacific Northwest. Old-growth forest, steep ravines, sections that haven't seen trail maintenance in decades because the funding just isn't there. As a wilderness ranger, my job was to patrol these areas, check for illegal camping or logging, maintain what trails existed, and occasionally assist with search and rescue operations when hikers got themselves into trouble. I'd been working that territory for 3 seasons when I got assigned to investigate reports of strange activity near the old mining settlement at Copperhead Hollow. The reports were vague, local hikers mentioning sounds, lights, the feeling of being watched. Nothing concrete enough to justify a full investigation, but enough that someone needed to go take a look. My name's Dakota Pruitt, and I wish I'd ignored that assignment entirely. Copperhead Hollow had been a small mining operation back in the 1890s, one of those boom-and-bust situations where someone found a modest copper vein, built a settlement, extracted what was economically feasible, and abandoned the whole operation when the ore ran out. By the time I hiked in there, nothing remained but a few collapsed structures, rusted equipment half buried in the undergrowth, and a mine entrance that had been sealed with concrete and steel bars decades ago for safety reasons. The hike-in was about 7 miles from the nearest trailhead, most of it off-trail navigation through dense forest. I made camp about a 1/4 mile from the old settlement, standard procedure. I wanted to observe the area without contaminating it with my presence. I set up my tent in a small clearing near a creek, filtered some water, made dinner on my camp stove. It was late August, warm days but cool nights, and the forest was thick with the smell of Douglas fir and decay. I spent the rest of that first day just watching the hollow. The settlement sat in a natural depression, surrounded by steep slopes on 3 sides. The 4th side opened toward the creek I'd camped near. From my vantage point, I could see most of the ruins, a few walls still standing, what had probably been the main shaft house for the mine, scattered debris. Nothing moved. No lights, no sounds except the normal forest ambient noise. I made notes, took some photos, and settled in for the night. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to voices. Not close by, these were coming from the direction of the hollow, maybe a couple 100 yards away. Multiple voices, having what sounded like a conversation. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm and cadence of people talking. My first thought was campers, maybe people who didn't realize this was a designated wilderness area where camping required permits. I got out of my tent, pulled on my boots, and grabbed my flashlight. Standard procedure was to make contact, check for permits, educate if necessary. As I moved through the forest toward the voices, they got clearer but not more comprehensible. The conversation continued, rises and falls, pauses like someone was listening and responding, but I still couldn't make out actual words, like they were speaking just below the threshold of clarity. I reached the edge of the hollow and stopped. My flashlight beam played across the ruins, but I didn't see anyone. The voices continued, and now I could pinpoint the source, the sealed mine entrance. The voices were coming from inside the mine. I moved closer, stepping carefully over rusted cable and rotted timber. The mine entrance was exactly as it should be, concrete seal intact, steel bars rust-covered but still firmly in place. And from the other side, from inside the mine, I could hear voices. Still having that conversation, never pausing long enough for me to call out, never quite forming words I could understand. I put my hand on the concrete seal. It was cold, much colder than it should have been given the ambient temperature, and I could feel vibration, subtle, rhythmic, like someone was striking something metal deep inside the mine, matching the cadence of the voices. "Hello," I called out. "This is Ranger Prout with the Forest Service. If someone's in there, you need to respond." The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence, so abrupt it felt like a physical thing. I stood there with my hand on the cold concrete, waiting. Then from inside the mine I heard footsteps, coming closer. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving in unison, getting louder as they approached the sealed entrance. I could hear them clearly now, boots on stone, the shuffle of movement, getting closer and closer until they must have been right on the other side of that concrete seal. They stopped. Right there, inches from where I stood. I held my breath, not moving, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly because my hand had started to tremble. Someone knocked on the concrete, 3 slow, deliberate knocks from the inside. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a piece of rusted equipment. The knocking came again, more insistent. Then a voice, clearer now, right at the edge of being understandable. "Let us out." 3 words, spoken by what sounded like multiple voices overlapping, not quite synchronized. "Let us out." I ran, not a tactical retreat, not a measured withdrawal. I just ran, crashing through the forest in a panic, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I didn't stop until I reached my campsite, and even then I didn't feel safe. I threw my gear into my pack with shaking hands, not bothering to fold the tent, just stuffing it in. I hiked out in the dark, using my flashlight and my GPS, 7 miles of stumbling over roots and rocks until I reached my truck at the trailhead just as the sun was coming up. I filed a report, kept it factual, heard voices near sealed mine entrance, appeared to originate from inside sealed structure, recommend investigation of seal integrity. I didn't mention the knocking. I didn't mention the request to be let out. A team went back 3 days later, 2 rangers and an engineer to check the seal. Their report noted that the concrete and bars showed no signs of compromise, no gaps or cracks, no way anyone could have gotten inside. They stayed overnight, heard nothing unusual. Case closed, probably just acoustic weirdness from wind moving through old mining tunnels, echoes creating the illusion of voices. I didn't argue, but I pulled the historical records on Copperhead Hollow, just out of curiosity. The mine had closed in 1893, after a collapse killed 12 workers. The bodies were never recovered. The company had just sealed that section and continued working a different part of the vein. When they finally abandoned the site 2 years later, they sealed everything, leaving those 12 miners entombed in the rock. I also found something else, a ranger report from 1974 describing unusual sounds near the old mine, and another from 1989 mentioning voices heard near the sealed entrance. and one from 2001. Every decade or so, someone reported the same thing, and every time, an investigation found nothing wrong with the seal, no evidence of intrusion. I requested reassignment to a different patrol area. My supervisor approved it without question. We were short-staffed, and rangers could be moved around as needed. I work the north section now, mostly alpine terrain above the tree line. Clean, open country where you can see for miles. But here's what keeps me awake sometimes. Before I hiked out that night, while I was frantically packing my camp, I turned off my flashlight for just a moment to let my eyes adjust, to make sure I wasn't being followed. In the darkness, I could see lights moving through the forest. Multiple lights, like flashlights or lanterns, moving in a group from the direction of Copperhead Hollow, coming toward me, methodical and purposeful. I turned my flashlight back on, and they vanished. Turned it off, and there they were again, closer now. I kept my light on for the entire hike out. I didn't look back. And when I reached my truck and finally felt safe enough to turn around, I saw them one more time. A cluster of lights at the forest edge, maybe 50 yards away, just standing there watching me. I got in my truck and drove until the sun came up. The mine is still sealed. The voices are still in there. And I think about those lights sometimes, wonder if what I heard that night was really the miners who died in 1893, or something else that found their voices and learned how to use them. Something that's been waiting down there for over a century, calling out to anyone who gets close enough to hear, calling out to be let out. The Story 5. The Wildlife Monitoring Station at Greywood Lake sits on the North Shore, a small prefab building that houses tracking equipment, data collection systems, and minimal living quarters for the researcher on duty. I'd taken the position as a seasonal wildlife technician primarily because the pay was decent, and it came with room and board, even if that board was limited to what could be kept in a mini fridge and heated on a hot plate. My primary responsibility was monitoring the elk population using the collar tracking system. We had 18 elk fitted with GPS collars that pinged their locations every 4 hours. My job was to record the data, note any anomalies, and alert the senior biologist if anything seemed off with the herd's movement patterns. I'm Sienna Voltaire, and I learned that elk know things we don't. They know when to leave. The station was comfortable enough. One main room with the computer equipment and my bunk, a small bathroom with a composting toilet, solar panels for power, and a backup generator. The lake itself was beautiful, especially in early autumn when I arrived. The water would turn these shades of gray-blue as storms moved through, and at dawn, mist would rise off the surface like something being born. I settled into a routine pretty quickly. Wake up, check the overnight data logs, make coffee, spend the day entering observations, and occasionally hiking out to check camera traps we'd placed at regular intervals around the lake. Evenings were quiet. I'd read, listen to podcasts on my laptop while I still had battery, watch the sunset over the water. The anomaly started showing up in the data around my 3rd week there. The elk had established a pattern over the summer months. They ranged across about 15 square miles, moving between feeding areas and bedding sites in predictable rotations. But starting September 9th, they began shifting their territory, not dramatically at first, just a gradual drift southward, away from the northern section of their range. Within a week, all 18 collared elk had moved to the southern edge of their territory and stopped. They weren't ranging anymore, weren't moving between areas. They just clustered together in one spot and stayed there. I called it in to Dr. Reeves, the senior biologist. She asked if there were any obvious stressors, predator activity, human presence, environmental changes. I told her I hadn't observed anything unusual. She said to keep monitoring, that elk sometimes exhibited clustering behavior in response to factors we couldn't easily detect. Probably nothing to worry about, but the elk knew. I'm sure of that now. On September 18th, I hiked out to check one of the camera traps on the North Shore, the area the elk had abandoned. It was about a 3-mile hike from the station, through fairly dense forest that opened up occasionally to give views of the lake. The camera was mounted on a tree near a game trail, positioned to catch whatever animals moved through the area. The camera's SD card showed hundreds of images from the past 2 weeks: deer, a black bear, various small mammals. But starting 5 days ago, the images changed. Instead of wildlife, the camera had triggered on nothing, just empty trail. But the timestamps showed the camera had fired every few minutes, sometimes multiple times in rapid succession, like something was moving past the sensor even though nothing appeared in the frame. I checked the camera itself. No technical malfunctions I could identify, sensor seemed fine, lens was clear. I swapped in a fresh SD card and started the hike back to the station. That's when I realized the forest was completely silent. Not gradually quiet, not just a lull in bird activity. Silent. No insects, no birds, no rustling in the undergrowth. The only sound was my own breathing and my boots on the trail. I stopped walking, listening, trying to identify what felt so wrong. And then I heard it walking parallel to me, maybe 30 yards to my left. Something large, moving through the forest, keeping pace with me. Not trying to hide, I could hear branches breaking, the crunch of leaves. But when I turned to look, I couldn't see anything through the trees. I started walking faster. Whatever it was matched my speed. When I jogged, it jogged. The sound stayed exactly 30 yards to my left, never getting closer, never falling behind. I broke into a run. The thing in the forest ran with me. I could hear it clearly now, crashing through undergrowth, big enough that it didn't bother with stealth. And beneath the sound of its movement, I could hear something else. A kind of breathing, but wrong. Too wet, too thick, like pulling air through mud. I reached the station and slammed the door behind me, throwing the bolt lock. Through the window, I watched the tree line, waiting for whatever had followed me to emerge. Nothing came out of the forest, but the sound continued, that wet, labored breathing now coming from multiple directions, surrounding the station. It lasted about 10 minutes, then silence again, just as abrupt as before. I checked the elk data immediately. All 18 were still clustered at the southern edge of their range. As far from my station as they could get while remaining in their territory. That night, something pressed against the walls of the station. I could hear it moving around the perimeter, feel the slight give in the prefab walls as it pushed against them, testing. The solar panels on the roof made scraping sounds, like something was running its hand, or whatever it had, across them. I sat on my bunk with my satellite phone in my hand, ready to call for emergency evacuation, but I didn't. What would I say? I couldn't see anything, couldn't photograph anything. I just had sounds and my own fear. In the morning, I found the marks, deep scratches in the metal siding of the station, running vertically from about 7 feet high down to ground level. 4 parallel gouges, each one about an inch wide. Whatever had made them had to be tall enough to reach that high, strong enough to dig through the outer layer of metal. I photographed them, documented everything, and called Dr. Reeves again. This time I didn't downplay it. I told her about the elk clustering, the sounds in the forest, the marks on the station. There was a long pause after I finished. "Pack your essential equipment," she said. "We are pulling you out. I'll have someone there by tomorrow morning." "What about the monitoring?" "We'll shut it down for the season. Just pack up and be ready." She didn't ask me to stay one more night. She didn't question my observations. That scared me more than anything else, the fact that she believed me immediately, that she didn't need convincing. I spent that last night with all the lights on, watching the windows. Around midnight, I saw something at the edge of the tree line, tall, pale, and thin in a way that seemed structurally impossible. It stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just at the edge of where the light from the windows reached, before stepping back into the darkness. The helicopter came at first light. The pilot was efficient, professional, helped me load my gear without asking questions about why we were evacuating mid-season. As we lifted off and I got a view of the whole area, I saw them. Shapes in the forest, dozens of them standing among the trees in a loose circle around where the station sat, all facing inward, all tall and pale and wrong. From the air, they looked almost human, almost. The station was dismantled 2 weeks later. Dr. Reeves said there were budget cuts, that we were consolidating resources. The official explanation for the elk behavior was attributed to a decrease in food sources, causing them to shift their range. But I've seen the private data. The collar signals from that area kept transmitting for 3 days after I left. Then, one by one, they went offline. All 18 elk signals dead within a 24-hour period. The recovery team that went in to investigate found the collars. Every single one of them laid out in a circle in the exact spot where the station had been. No elk, no blood, no signs of predation. Just the collars arranged deliberately, forming a perfect circle. I work in a lab now. Indoor work, surrounded by people, nothing but data sets and computer screens. It's what I need. But I still check the Graywood Lake area on satellite imagery sometimes, and I've noticed something that probably doesn't mean anything. The forest there is dying. Not gradually, not from disease or fire, just dying, spreading outward in a circle from where the station used to be. Dead trees, no undergrowth, bare earth. And the circle is getting larger. Something claiming that territory. Something that the elk knew to run from, and I wasn't smart enough to leave until it was almost too late. A story 6. I worked fire suppression for 7 years before I requested a transfer to trail maintenance. Better hours, less danger, more time outdoors without the constant stress of wildfire season. My supervisor was surprised. Most rangers move the opposite direction, seeking the adrenaline and significance of fire work rather than the relative obscurity of trail maintenance. But I was tired of the smoke and the chaos and the ways fire changes a landscape into something alien. Trail maintenance suited me. I'd spend weeks in the backcountry with a small crew, clearing fallen trees, fixing erosion damage, rebuilding bridges over creeks. Honest work that left visible improvement behind. My name's Jerome Castellano, and I miss those simple days before Whistler Ridge. The assignment came in June. Whistler Ridge Trail was a 12-mile loop that hadn't been maintained in at least 3 years, maybe longer. Budget cuts, staffing shortages, the usual story. We'd gotten complaints from hikers about blowdowns blocking the trail, making it difficult to follow. My crew was just 2 people, me and a younger ranger named Tyler Bosch, fresh out of his training program and enthusiastic about everything. We hiked in with tools and camping gear, planning to spend 4 days working the trail in sections. The ridge itself sat at about 6,000 feet, not particularly high, but isolated enough that we saw maybe 3 or 4 hikers a day during peak season. This early in summer, we'd probably have the place to ourselves. The first day went exactly as planned. We cleared 2 major blowdowns, a massive Douglas fir that had fallen across the trail and required chainsaw work to section up and roll off the path. Tyler was good with the tools, didn't complain about the physical work, and seemed genuinely excited to be doing maintenance. I liked him, reminded me of myself at that age, back when the job still felt like an adventure rather than a routine. We made camp that evening about 6 miles into the loop, at a flat spot just off the trail where previous crews had obviously camped before. There was a fire ring, some logs arranged for sitting. Tyler got a small fire going despite my suggestion that we didn't really need one. The evening was warm enough. But he was young and fires are part of the camping experience, so I let it go. You ever see anything weird out here? Tyler asked once we'd eaten dinner and were just sitting, watching the fire burn down. Like paranormal stuff. I told him the truth. I'd seen plenty of things that seemed weird at first, lights in the forest that turned out to be bioluminescent fungi, sounds that seemed impossible but were just mating calls from animals most people never encounter. The wilderness is full of phenomena that seem supernatural until you understand them. But no, I said, nothing actually paranormal. Why? Tyler shrugged. My training officer told me stories. Said some areas in the forest, rangers just avoid them. Not because of danger, but because of how they feel. Said there are places that don't want people there. I laughed it off. Rookie talk, the kind of thing you tell trainees to spook them. But that night, after Tyler had gone to his tent and I was lying in mine, I kept thinking about what he'd said. About places that don't want people there. The sound woke me sometime after midnight. Whistling, clear melodic whistling, like someone walking down the trail past our camp. A tune I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. I listened to it approach, pass by our camp maybe 20 feet away, and continue down the trail. I got out of my tent. The moon was bright enough that I could see the trail clearly. Nobody there. The whistling continued, moving away from camp, fading into the distance. I stood there in my thermal underwear, listening to it disappear, trying to convince myself it was just a hiker, someone doing a night hike with a headlamp I somehow couldn't see. In the morning, I checked the trail near camp. No footprints. The dust on the trail was undisturbed, showing only our tracks from the previous day. Tyler didn't mention hearing anything, and I didn't bring it up. No point in spooking him over something I couldn't explain. The second day, we worked a section of trail that followed the ridgeline, with steep drop-offs on one side and thick forest on the other. Around midday, Tyler stopped working and stood staring into the trees. "You see that?" he asked. "See what?" "Someone just moved back there, behind those hemlocks. I saw them watching us." I looked, dense forest, shadows, nothing moving. Probably a deer. It was standing upright, on 2 legs. We watched the forest for a few minutes. Nothing moved. I told Tyler to keep working, that if someone was out there, they'd show themselves eventually or they'd leave. People sometimes got off trail, got lost, acted strange out of embarrassment or disorientation. But I kept feeling it after that. The sensation of being watched, of someone just out of sight, observing our work. Tyler felt it too. I could tell by the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, by how he'd stopped talking mid-sentence to listen. That evening, we heard the whistling again. This time it came from the forest, not the trail. Circling our camp, the same tune over and over. Sometimes it seemed close, sometimes distant, but it never stopped for more than a few seconds before starting again. "That's not a person," Tyler said. We were both standing outside our tents now, trying to pinpoint the source. People don't whistle the same thing for 20 minutes straight. He was right, and underneath the whistling, I could hear something else now that I was really listening. Footsteps matching the rhythm of the tune, walking around our camp in a wide circle, never getting closer, never moving away. "Pack up," I said. "We are leaving. It's dark, and we've got another 2 days of work." Now, Tyler, pack your gears. We hiked out by headlamp, moving fast, leaving some of our tools behind because they'd slow us down. The whistling followed us for the first 2 miles, always behind us, maintaining the same distance. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. We made it back to the trailhead around 3 in the morning, exhausted and rattled. I filed a report the next day, kept it vague. Possible wildlife encounters caused crew to evacuate. Trail work incomplete. Recommend reassessment before sending another crew. Another crew went back 2 weeks later. Tyler wasn't on it. He'd requested leave, decided to visit family in Oregon for a while. The new crew finished the work without incident. No whistling, no feeling of being watched, nothing unusual. But here's what I found out later, when I went digging through old ranger reports. Whistler Ridge had been called something else originally. Back in the 30s, before the current trail system was established, it was called Whistler's Ridge on topographical maps, named after a hermit who'd lived up there in the 20s, a guy who was known for hiking the ridge and whistling constantly while he walked. He died in 1927, fell off the trail on the east side, body not recovered for weeks. They found him at the base of a cliff with every bone in his legs shattered. But the thing that bothered the recovery team, the detail that ended up in the report, was that he had small stones in his mouth, like he'd been chewing on them or like someone had forced them in there. The cause of death was listed as accidental fall. But the report noted that the position of his body suggested he'd been running when he went over the edge. Running from something, or running towards something he'd been following. I don't work in that district anymore. I transferred to a different forest, different mountains, trails I'd never heard of. Tyler left the Park Service entirely. I heard he's working construction now, indoor work when he can get it. And sometimes, when I'm working a remote section of trail and it's very quiet, I think I hear it. That whistling just at the edge of hearing. The same tune I heard on Whistler Ridge, repeated over and over, never quite resolving, never quite finishing. And I remembered Tyler's question, are there places that don't want people there? The answer is yes. And some of them have ways of making that known that we still don't understand. A story 7. The boundary rider position is one of those jobs most people don't know exists. Essentially, you patrol the borders between national forest land and private property, checking for encroachment, illegal logging, trespassing, maintenance issues with boundary markers. It's solitary work, requires someone comfortable with long days alone in remote areas, and the pay reflects that. It's one of the better paid ranger positions despite being one of the least desirable. I took the job because I wanted the solitude. After spending 3 years working popular trail systems, dealing with the constant stream of unprepared hikers and the trash they left behind, the idea of patrolling empty boundary lines felt like a luxury. I'm Iris Wakefield, and I learned that boundaries exist for reasons that aren't always about property lines. My assigned territory covered about 40 miles of boundary, most of it running through old-growth forest so dense that the property line markers were often hidden under decades of debris. I'd spend days hiking the boundary with my GPS, checking that markers were still in place, documenting any issues. Occasionally, I'd encounter someone from the private land side, a hunter with permission from the landowner, sometimes a contractor checking survey points, but usually I was alone. Just me and the forest, and the invisible line that separated one kind of ownership from another. The incident started in a way that seemed routine. I was working a section of boundary about 15 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by foot trail and then bushwhacking. My GPS showed that I was approaching a corner marker, the point where 3 property boundaries met. These corners were usually marked with something substantial, often a concrete post or a pile of stones. What I found was neither. The corner marker was a tree, not a tree with a marker attached to it. The tree itself was the marker. Someone had carved symbols into the bark, deep gouges that had healed over with scar tissue, making them permanent. The carvings covered the trunk from about shoulder height down to the ground, an intricate pattern of lines and shapes that looked deliberate but made no sense to me. I photographed it, documented the GPS coordinates, made notes. The tree was massive, a cedar, probably 300 years old, with a trunk wide enough that 3 people couldn't have wrapped their arms around it. The carvings were old, the scar tissue suggesting they'd been made decades ago at least. As I was photographing, I noticed something at the base of the tree, objects arranged in a circle around the trunk. Stones, bones, pieces of metal so rusted they were barely recognizable, and fresh flowers. Wild flowers that couldn't have been there more than a day or 2, still holding color. Someone was maintaining this place. Someone was still coming here, leaving offerings. I should have left then, should have finished documenting and moved on to the next section of boundary. But I was curious. Who would be maintaining a shrine, that's what it clearly was, out here in the middle of nowhere? And why at a property boundary? I spent the next hour searching the area around the marked tree. I found more objects, scattered in a rough perimeter maybe 50 yards out from the cedar. More stones, more bones, pieces of fabric tied to branches. And I found a trail, barely visible, but definitely there once you knew what to look for. Not on my maps, not official, just a faint path worn by repeated use. I followed it. The trail led deeper into the forest, winding between massive trees, crossing small streams on stones placed deliberately for that purpose. It showed no sign of recent use, no fresh footprints, no broken vegetation, but the path itself was clear enough that I could follow it without difficulty. After about half a mile, the trail opened into a clearing. Natural or man-made, I couldn't tell, but the space was maybe 30 feet across, almost perfectly circular. The ground was bare earth, nothing growing there despite being surrounded by dense forest. And in the center of the clearing was another tree. This one was dead. Had been dead for a long time, bleached white by weather and time. But it stood upright, and it was covered in carvings. The same symbols I'd seen on the boundary marker, but more of them, more complex, covering every inch of visible wood. And hanging from the branches were dozens of objects. Photographs in plastic bags, letters tied with string, small toys, items of clothing. All weathered but protected from the worst of the elements by the tree's remaining branches. I realized I was looking at a memorial. People had been coming here for years, maybe decades, leaving tokens, remembering someone or something. I took one step into the clearing and the temperature dropped. Not gradually, it was a sudden plunge, like stepping from summer into deep winter. My breath fogged, the forest sounds stopped, and I heard breathing, not my own, coming from everywhere at once, slow and steady. The kind of breathing you hear when someone's sleeping, but amplified, surrounding me. I backed out of the clearing very slowly, not taking my eyes off that dead tree. The breathing continued, following me. When I reached the trail, I turned and ran. I ran all the way back to the boundary line, to the marked cedar tree with its offerings. The breathing didn't follow me past that point. It stopped right at the tree, like that cedar was a barrier it couldn't cross. I documented everything: the clearing, the memorial tree, the trail, the objects. When I got back to civilization 3 days later, I filed a detailed report and asked my supervisor if he knew anything about that area. He did. He pulled out a file that was older than I was, explained that back in the 70s, a family had disappeared in that area. Mother, father, 2 kids. They'd been hiking, wandered off trail, never came back. The search lasted weeks, found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, just gone. But hikers in the years after that started reporting strange phenomena, sounds, sensations of being followed, encounters with something they couldn't describe. And people started leaving offerings at that cedar tree, which was right at the boundary between the search area and the forest beyond. The offerings were supposed to keep the family at rest, or keep whatever had taken them from spreading. "You found the clearing?" my supervisor asked. I nodded. "We're not supposed to talk about it officially." "It's technically on private land, just barely. The family that owns that parcel won't discuss it. They've owned it for generations, never develop it, never go there. They just pay the taxes and leave it alone." "What's there?" I asked. "What took that family?" Didn't have an answer. Nobody did. Just theories, stories, the kind of folklore that grows around tragedy and mystery. I requested reassignment. My supervisor approved it without question. Someone else patrols that boundary now, a ranger who's been doing it for years and knows not to follow trails that aren't on the maps. But here's what I think about sometimes. Those fresh flowers at the base of the boundary tree. Someone is still going there, still maintaining that barrier, still leaving offerings. And that means someone knows what's in that clearing, knows what needs to be kept on the other side of that line. I wonder who they are. I wonder what they know. And I wonder what would happen if people stopped leaving offerings, if that boundary stopped being maintained, if whatever's in that clearing decided to cross the line. I don't think I want to know, but sometimes, late at night, I wonder if we'll find out anyway. If some boundary rider in the future will patrol that line and find the cedar tree dead, the offerings scattered, and nothing left to hold back whatever's been waiting in that clearing, waiting for us to stop paying attention, waiting for the boundary to fail. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.